Welcome to another episode of Friends in Wonder, a place where we invite you to explore meaningful topics without judgment or limits.
Brought to you by two lifelong friends sharing their insights while wondering, how can this help?
I'm Joe Luther.
And I'm Vince Kern.
And we've got great topics lined up for you each week, so be sure to subscribe, like, and even share with your friends.
Now let's wander and wonder together.
Well, Vince, this week we have the opportunity to kind of turn the mic around. Last week you had the chance to interview me about part of my career arc, and this week we're going to dive into something that's near and dear to your heart, and that has to do with, well, the digital revolution and what that did to the delivery of news, because you and I were born and lived in a time when that industry changed an awful lot. And you, of course, had a front row seat and were actually an active participant in what happened in the news industry during the digital revolution. So today I get to talk to you a little bit about your career. And, I think that's what we need to do first is maybe just give the listener some background. And I think part of that will kind of create the story itself, because it shows how you were part of a very interesting time in the news industry.
Indeed. So I get to sit in the guest seat today, I suppose, is what you're trying to tell me. And you're going to pepper me with a bunch of questions. And
if I get the opportunity, you might take the mic and run
paybacks are hell. Yeah, no, we live in, and my dad used to say this all the time. He used to say, "Oh, there's the Chinese proverb, may you live in interesting times." And by gosh, we certainly do, Joe. I mean, the information explosion in our lifetime is unbelievable. And I got to tell you, I was looking at I got a shout out to my niece, Eliza, and niece-in-law, Justin, who just had twin boys, and sent me a picture of their twin boys in knitted peas. So they're peas in a pod. And I thought to myself, I can only imagine how their life is going to be and what kind of change they're going to experience. I mean, these young twins, Jason and Jackson, are going to be born in an age where the volume of digital information and content that's out there is just unbelievable. Whereas, we grew up in a different time, and I call it, this sort of transition from analog to digital. So, we grew up in a very analog time. I mean, there were lots of digital things going on and progressing in the 60s when we were kids. And as we've mentioned, we both had paper routes, and that was really my first experience to the reading the news and the newspaper content.
Yeah, I mean, it speaks to the way news was delivered when we were young, and we were part of that. And really, obviously, some of this stuff is self-evident, but I think to discuss it in a quick overview of how you went from paper boy to an executive in a major newspaper during the digital revolution. Let's talk about it real quickly. And
I guess I got to do a little resume review here for those who don't know me, and even those who do know me. Probably, all these dots get connected in different ways. Actually, I did create a newspaper in fourth grade. I think the headlines were something like, they were very funny. Tigers lose. They're about something about a catcher's jockstrap who fell off during the game, and infantile things like that. But I literally drew out a newspaper, had pictures of things going on and that sort of thing. Now, fast forward to paper boy, and I remember the thing that is when we grew up, of course, newspapers were an everyday thing. Mom and dad had them on the breakfast table or the afternoon table, depending on when your newspaper came out. And that's how everybody pretty much got their news, except for that little 6 o'clock half-hour slice. And
Right. Newspapers were dailies. There was no
daily
such thing.
newspapers, yeah. And a lot of this is, very, very cliche in a
And
sense.
there were multiple ones. There was the Detroit News, which was the big one, and then there were neighborhood newspapers as well.
Right,
And
you'd get
some of
your
those
local
were daily.
paper, your and national papers. Now you had to go to the store to buy the national papers. They didn't have home delivery of New York Times back
Or a
then.
Wall Street Journal, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Right. And they were hard to find.
Obviously, you were always drawn to news and delivery of news. And I didn't even know that you created your own newspaper in fourth grade.
Well,
But
I haven't shown it to too many people. So
well, no, but that speaks to really what you knew in your heart you wanted to do. And in fact, then you went to college and you actually studied journalism, didn't you?
yeah, I was always fascinated with writing. And I think one of the things that having a newspaper route did was gave me a real appreciation for what was out there. And so by the time I got to college, I really didn't know exactly what I wanted to do. At first, I thought it was radio, and I thought that I had a good radio voice. I certainly had a good radio face, and I took some classes.
No argument here.
But there was one class that just fascinated me. It was with a guy named Glenn Macnow, who wrote for the Free Press, and he taught a print journalism class and ran us through all of the things about being a reporter. And frankly, I was hooked, and that began a career of stringing for local newspapers. I wrote for the Oakland Press, the Royal Oak Tribune.
So you were doing this as a college student?
Yeah,
You
as a
were-
college
you were
student.
freelance writing, and then you actually became the editor of our college newspaper. I went
South
to the
End.
same. I went to the same university, Wayne State University in Detroit.
Right, Wayne State University it's a commuter school. It was an interesting paper because it was a 10,000 circulation daily that was distributed not only on campus but around the whole Midtown area, and we're talking about the mid '80s here. So,
And we're talking about you being 20 some years old. And I got to tell you, from my vantage point, seeing you become the editor of that newspaper, and it was a significant newspaper in Detroit. It was kind of like an offbeat hip newspaper for even non-students to read. But when you became editor of that newspaper, I started to take notice. Maybe Vince really will do something in this industry.
yeah. Well, it's funny. It was quite a rebellious newspaper. And one of the reasons for that is that it was completely student run. There was no faculty telling them what to write. And one of the missions at that time was to bring the newspaper back to a more journalistic endeavor for journalism students and people who really wanted to experience the newspaper as it is traditionally, as opposed to sort of a rebellious place. And that was a goal. And one of the things that they did at that time was bought a new computer system. And this is really where the story kind of begins. I was tasked with the process of researching and purchasing and implementing a networked computer system, which at the time there were very few in any newspapers. And this was a PC networked system. So I got exposure to technology at a very early age. I had already been a freelance journalist for a number of years, and the two kind of melded together in a very interesting way. And I could go down a lot of rabbit holes with that, but suffice to say, as I got closer to graduation, I applied for some internships at the Detroit News, and interesting things happened. One of them was that 3 freshman journalists got the internships instead of me. And at the time, there was a great movement, and I was part of that because I worked with this Journalism Institute for Minorities to help promote minorities in the newspaper business. Frankly, it was an all-white, pretty much all-male reporting business. And when I was turned down for those internships, a guy called me on the phone and said, "Look, I want to give you some advice. If you want to become a journalist and just a reporter, you can do that at any time in your career, but you have technology in your background, and that's where things are going. So,
Kind of like in The Graduate where it said think plastics. This
think
was
exactly
a guy whispering in your ear, think
right.
technology.
I had been offered a job to travel the country putting in these systems all over in newsrooms.
So wait a minute, you got offered a job right around the time you were graduating to work in
Supposed to
the
graduate.
industry.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I spoke, and this anonymous phone call who said, I know you're frustrated probably because you're better qualified than any of the interns that are coming in, but here's an idea for you. And then I ran that by a mentor, and he basically confirmed it. So I took the job, and I wound up traveling all over the country, putting in systems in newsrooms all over the country.
What was the name of that company? I see. Was that the C text?
Yeah, that was
Oh
C-Text,
yeah.
and
Yeah.
they were
What
one
did
of the
C stand for?
C stand for the language of programming. So it was
Oh.
written in C. And so it was C text. And the premise is, I mean, if you think about it today, these were very low powered PCs networked together, and it was all text. There was really no graphics. It was about,
Well, you mean low powered in today's terms, but back then it was cutting edge.
well, back then, a floppy disk, for instance, was maybe a couple of meg you could store on it at the most, and it was the size. It was 5.25 inches or 3.5 inches wide, and all that
Okay,
stuff.
boomer.
So
All right, we get it, boomer.
so I wound up traveling all over the country, and that's where I really learned newsroom operations. I already had the journalism background. Now I'm picking up the process, the production, the business, the whole 9 yards.
So this CTEX was basically bringing technology to all of the analog printing operations around the country, and you were in the front lines of bringing that to all of these newspapers.
Right. There was no Macintoshes. Macs were not prevalent in newsrooms at the time. There was no internet. There were no mobile phones. It was still,
I mean, many newspapers were still doing the old typeface of putting things together manually, right?
exactly right. And so, and that's an interesting segue because the New York Post hired me because they wanted to start a Sunday edition, and so they hired me away from CTEX, and I moved to New York and lived in Brooklyn and commuted to Manhattan every day, and managed their computer systems, which were across the board, and that was still mainframe systems and all kinds of other things. But again, this point of merging the journalism experience with the technology experience, and then a very significant thing happened. A paper that I had put a system in east of San Diego wanted a sort of a technology slash journalist person to literally run their newsroom. So at the ripe old age of 29, I became the top person in the newsroom at the Daily Californian, which was a 50,000 circulation daily. And
I remember when that happened. That was quite an opportunity for a young man. And I will tell you again, Vince and I have been best friends ever since we were 7 years old. And I watched him go from New York and then to California, following these paths that I really was. I was a homebody. I stayed in Metro Detroit my whole life, and I was amazed at your willingness to go take on these challenges in places where you had no contacts. In the Daily California, you really got thrown into a big opportunity.
yeah, it was pretty cool. It was a pretty cool time. Uh, and when I got to California, there was a lot of interesting things that happened there, and I think we'll down the road be talking about a lot of the interesting stories that came about. But in a sense, one of them was all of a sudden I was running the newspaper at 29 years old, and I had to pinch myself because it was like, how did I get here? How did I achieve this career goal that I had, just 8 or 9 years ago? And in some senses, I was well equipped. In other senses, I wasn't, because the experience of leading a newsroom is something that no matter how much you have, it's experiential. But
Yeah, that's probably a topic for another episode. But The
Yeah,
important thing is to describe the way that you were involved in the news creation, you were involved in the news delivery and production and all of that at a time when the industry was changing dramatically.
Yeah, now we're talking about the early, well, from the late '80s to the early '90s, and that's when the internet hit, and that's when things really started changing. And to bring this back to our topic about how news distribution and consumption started changing, the internet came about, and some newspapers were dabbling in websites, but at that point, I was really more involved with helping them improve their processes through streamlining technology. But shortly thereafter, in '95, I left and came back to Detroit to work for the Detroit News and Free Press. And that was when things really started happening.
Yeah, you came back to really the newspaper that you delivered as a boy, and that was our icon in Detroit. And we had two daily newspapers in Detroit, the Free Press and the News. But I think at that time, or maybe during when you were there, they kind of merged, didn't they?
They merged before I was there, and there were a lot of things.
But you got to be part of this big giant monolith, and you were doing it at a time when the industry was changing.
The industry was changing big time. There were a lot of things by the time I came to Detroit that were already eating away at newspapers' ability to sustain the kind of journalism that it always had in the past in terms of resources. The information explosion started. You really think about cable TV and eBay. All of these things were eating away at the advertising advertising revenues for newspapers, and readership was already declining from cable news and other things that had begun to disseminate information in a more of a 24-hour news cycle. And the internet certainly was a big part of that. But still, you had two platforms for newspapers at the time. You had either the website that where people were still developing and trying to figure out how to make revenues off of, an online product where people could literally get it for free, and as opposed to the printed product, and how people's preferred to consume information, the tactile feeling of newspaper versus
And so,
digital.
yeah, how did you navigate it at the Detroit News? Because I know, just because I know you, that you were involved in an awful lot of think tanking within the executive boardrooms at the Detroit News on how to manage this transition from analog newspapers to the digital world. And obviously there's revenues that spoke to that, because at the time during that transition, people were getting things for free, and the newspaper business model was, you got to pay for my newspaper. And people saying, what do I need that thing for? I can go on the internet and get access to it for free. So you were in the middle of all of that. And that's really what we want to talk about today. Apart from your involvement in this, is what does that mean to the consumers today of how we get our newspaper? But I guess before we get there, tell us all a little bit more about what it was like to be a part of this giant monolith that was staring at the headlights, or the oncoming train of the digital world.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring that out, because Detroit really was a breeding ground for innovation for Gannett, which owned the newspapers. The Detroit News was owned separately by a different company, but basically it was Gannett running the show. And at the time, they were the largest media newspaper company in the country, and so Detroit became this sort of breeding ground for innovation. And frankly, I got to tell you, by about 2008 or so, I had transitioned into more of an R&D role with the newspapers, and there was some of the greatest innovative minds that I've ever worked with there. The publishers, the editorial people. I could name, dozens of people that really were innovators, and Gannett sort of used us as a breeding ground. One of the things that happened around 2009 was that the delivery model just basically became unsustainable, and delivery trucks were driving 300,000 miles a night. The cost of gas, the cost of newsprint, the downward trend in circulation. I mean, things were going down 5% every 6 months in terms of printed circulation.
Yeah. And like you said, the eBays and all these other ways of selling things, what classifieds were such a big part of the revenues of newspapers, and that was disappearing.
Right. But what was appearing were smartphones and e-readers and Kindles and all kinds of electronic devices, where a lot of concepts that were burgeoning in the industry on how to gain efficiencies in production, but also how to navigate the digital world, were became tasks for Detroit. It was really interesting time. There had been sort of a patriotic leadership.
Archic, who knows, Vince? But I love you. I
You know
love
what
your
I'm
desire
saying.
to create words, Vince.
and a lot of women who had been working in Detroit became the top leaders. And I have to tell you, it was really refreshing, because the level of innovation and different types of thinking were really refreshing. And they were leading the path with a great publisher named David Hunke, who decided to make a drastic change in the distribution model. And by 2009, we were going to cut home delivery to 3 days, which would be a Thursday, Friday, and Sunday. And we partnered with a burgeoning e-reader company to deliver the newspaper via this e-reader, and we were going to subsidize this e-reader for people who could read it at home, and design it, be the use of PDFs and send this out. Now, at the same time, the iPad was in its development. And long story short, the point of this is that newspapers were trying to decide how to format their content on all of these new evolving platforms. Smartphones, the iPad was going to be coming out. We were doing it to a black and white e-reader, so we were taking PDFs and creating touch points. So if you can imagine that, and we were just about to pull the trigger on that when the iPad came out, and it changed everything. The iPad literally changed the way everything was going to happen, because they not only took control over the digital content delivery in the form of apps, which really hadn't been developed yet, but were coming, but they also started to eat into the subscription model. So originally, Apple was going to take 30% of any paid subscription to a newspaper. So the dilemma for newspapers was, do we offer it for free and count on advertising revenue from other sources? How does this all work out? That's a whole nother episode, and that's a lot of inside hardball. But suffice to say that it was a really critical point for the newspaper industry, because nobody really knew what was going to happen.
Yeah, there was a lot of pivoting going on at that time. And just so I understand, what you're saying is the innovators in Detroit, and even this female leadership group that you were a part of, were kind of like a template or a testing ground for what Gannett wanted to do internationally or across the nation with other newspapers. So you were really involved in a lot of the transition in the business model of how to deliver news.
Yeah, my role at the time was to help redesign the content for this e-ink reader. And I remember when we went to CES, which is the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas, this product was unveiled. There were 3 newspapers that were on this platform. It was the Detroit News and the Detroit Free Press, which is actually 2 newspapers, the Wall Street Journal, and USA Today, which was also a Gannett company. There were only three, and there was a lot of hubbub about it, and it was very exciting. That was in early 2010, and I believe it was March when the iPad came out, and all of that went by the wayside. The big reason was that this e-reader was that we were working with was going to cost about $700, and the iPad came out at about $399 to start.
Oh, so the idea was people were going to buy this kind of like a Kindle, and they were going to get their newspapers that way. But when the iPad came out, everybody had to pretty much change and play ball with Apple.
Right. And the thing that moves this forward into more of a today's type of scenario is that you had Google and Yahoo and all of these internet search providers and out there now by this time who were able to curate links from newspapers and newspaper articles and display them for free. There were platforms out there that were literally curate news articles that you could build. So that content was being given away for free. And so the business model for newspapers was really in trouble. And that's when it started to shift from more of a subscription service to clicks. And this is part of the conversation is of how does this help is what happened to the actual content itself going forward, where you are marketing now to advertisers based on clicks and based on
the whole concept of what is journalism anymore, right? I mean, journalism when you were a paper boy was very clear. You were delivering a newspaper that journalists had written. Obviously, there was different forms of journalism within a newspaper. But then when it went to the digital age, it became more about clickbait, right?
Well, in a lot of sense, yeah. I mean, I can tell you a story about, I think it was around 2014. Ben Affleck was in Detroit recording a movie, and he took his dog for a walk, and across the street was Channel 4 WDIV, and his dog defecated on the lawn, and someone had a picture of that, and it was posted on I think it was the Free Press. And I remember all the hubbub about Ben Affleck and having him in the news. And they had this system where they would promote stories based on click. You had this big, huge screen in the newsroom, and it could tell you in real time. And this thing just exploded to the top. And I remember thinking, oh my God, this is this is where consumers are today. It's more about now pictures. I mean, if you think about it, Facebook became public in 2006. Instagram became public in 2009, and the statistics are just amazing of how people moved into those platforms for, I won't call it news, but talk about competing for time in news consumption.
Yeah, and it almost became instead of journalism, it became tabloidism, and of course that all got sorted out eventually because people want journalism. It's just that when we went from that transition of analog to digital, things became very murky, and you again were right there in the middle of it all. So tell me, how did it? Think back to your last few years at the Detroit News, and what would you say sticks out for you the most during that time when it went from analog to digital?
Yeah, the thing that sticks out to me the most is that, and perhaps rightfully so, newspapers had sort of were the only game in town situation for hundreds of years. They were the only game in town, and to pivot from that business model to a new one where everything was so nascent, and nobody knew in any business, frankly, nobody knew how smartphones and tablets were going to change any business. But the information explosion in itself. I mean, there's a chart that I have seen, and it basically talks about the information explosion. And you talk about the earliest written record in 3000 BC, and you go to the printing press in 1450. That's a huge explosion of information into our culture. So, I mean, speaking anthropologically here, in 1900, the London Library had 500,000 books, and that's pretty much I think the number of books that existed in the world. And then the internet explosion happened, and this arc of data that's out there literally went on a 90-degree angle upward. And this particular
when you
data
say the
point,
arc of data, you're saying the consumer accessibility to data, or
yeah,
just
what's out.
data.
Yeah, exactly. It could be any kind of accessibility to any kind of digital data volume that's out there. By 2002, only 1% of all of that was stored on paper. So that gives you an idea how all of this just transitioned to a digital world. And in 2010, the amount of information and data that we have created and put out there equals 2 stacks of books running from Earth to Pluto. Now, now the fact that somebody can even figure that out in 5 to 10 minutes is pretty amazing, because it would have taken a mathematician probably days to do that back in the BC days. But it gets back to this thing about living in interesting times. So the thing that sticks out to me the most about that time is going around statewide doing research on people's news habits. And we're talking 2011, 2012, interviewing people across the state. And I remember one interview in particular was with a 65-year-old woman at the time, who was one of the few people who had an app on her smartphone for news in her age group. And she just was telling me that everybody was just astounded by it. And now, 65-year-olds, pretty much everybody's got a smartphone. I mean, that sticks out to me, the answers to the questions of what was going on back then.
You know what I wanted to ask though, Vince, is because we're talking about how the delivery of news has changed. And one of the things that I guess has disappeared for the most part, and correct me if I'm wrong, is the idea of a news editor. And that editor was kind of like the police officer of true journalism and what would be considered newsworthy and properly written or fairly or balanced or whatever it is. And now, really, do editors like that even exist? It's more direct. There's no middleman. There's really no policeman of what is news anymore. Is that would you say that's fair?
I'd say that's fair to a certain extent. I think there are still editors in newsrooms, and they edit to a certain degree, but I think there's a lot fewer. There's certainly a lot fewer editors in the newsrooms. Journalists now are expected to not only write their own article, but take their own pictures and provide all kinds of other types of things with their submission. And as it's done in real time, it's not always a smooth, clean process. I think the editing thing gets into a discussion of self-publishing and what began to happen with Twitter and with Facebook, and certainly to some degree with Instagram, is that now you've got this smartphone in your hand and you can publish anything from anywhere to various social platforms, which really were evolving at the time of all of the things I'm talking about happened. And it was this unknown human behavior trend. I was on the forefront of Facebook and Instagram and Twitter as part of my job, and I was probably one of the first subscribers to all of those platforms within the very early age. I shouldn't say first, but a very early age.
Sure, you were one of the first. Yeah.
And I remember thinking, oh, these are great. We're going to be able to put out all kinds of information for people, and it's going to all be beneficial and everything else. Well, as humans, we don't always take the tools that we develop and use them in the best way possible. And you can put that editing conversation into the question of what is news and how is it consumed. I'll give you an example of to answer the question, what is news? Is news news is, if it's a meaningful contribution to someone's life, that's a very general definition. So if I'm on Nextdoor and I see somebody post a question of, hey, there's this new building going up at the end of the street there next to the shopping center. What is it? And someone can answer that question. Oh, that's a new Kentucky Fried Chicken. Well, that's news, but I didn't get it from the newspaper. I didn't get it from the website of the newspaper, and I probably didn't get it from the smartphone. I got it from an app that's called Nextdoor that uh, is a whole new thing.
So your idea of news, which maybe, I mean, is an interesting question, is that it's information, information that people need or want to know.
News or need or want to know. Now, the question in today's world, and this is obviously where we're at today, is whether that news is accurate, whether it's misinformation, and this whole ability of having the choice of reading on multiple platforms like Substack or Twitter or
There's so much out there. And on the one hand, that's great because in the old days, when I read the Detroit News in analog form, I was only getting what the editor in chief of the Detroit News deemed I was going to get. And today, I can go to any electronic device and get news from all across the world wherever I desire. And from my standpoint, that's an improvement, having access to all this other information that wouldn't otherwise be available in the analog form. But of course, there's the flip side to it, right? If you've got so much access to this, how do you sift through it? And how do you know, like I asked about the editor, how do you know what's accurate? How do you know, what is manipulative or propaganda? And that's really, I guess, the interesting thing. And that's why I thought it would be great to talk about your career arc today, which is really the delivery of news. You've been involved in delivering news your whole career, really. And today that is such an interesting topic. What is news and how is it delivered and how do we sift through it all?
Yeah, to sum up all of the preambling about my career, I was there at a very, very fascinating time. I mean, I almost feel like I was, part of the control room people in NASA launching rockets, and watching what was going on. I can tell you a quick story about, where things were back then. I remember I was asked to give a presentation on Twitter and what it was, and it was evolving and just coming out, and Twitter had this thing called hashtags. So I was telling the executive board someday and in the not too near future, every tweet's going to have hashtags and you're going to have people tweeting about TV shows. So when they're watching or a baseball game, for instance, so this audience of content consumers has now evolved from, a newspaper giving a game summary of a story to somebody using a hashtag called Tiger Baseball and posting about it as they watch it on television. Or it could be your favorite, series, drama series, or whatever it is. And I remember the looks on the faces of all of the some of the news editors and some of the people sitting around the boardroom. They were scoffing.
They were saying that they're never going to replace the horse. Is that what
it'll never happen? It'll never happen. It'll never happen. And I sort of got laughed out of that presentation. And those are the kinds of things I remember. But again, it gets back to the self-publishing thing today and this conversation about how does it help and how does it not help? I go back to the twins in the two peas in the pod and Jason and Jackson. And I think about the world they're growing up in. And this gets back to living in interesting times. I mean, think about what our grandparents experienced in their lifetime. Think about what our parents experienced in their lifetime. Think about the things that we've experienced in our lifetime. And now think about a baby born in 2023, where, they're at this point of real inflection. And I think the inflection point is going to be, how do we as humans handle this information explosion,
bombardment?
Yeah, I mean, think about it. It's only been 30 years or so.
I don't think we've figured it out yet. That's for sure. And I think that's really what today's episode was kind of meant to draw a light on, is that you were part of this change, and describing your history with how it has evolved over the last, 40 years is, and the way, as you say, with your nieces, your grandnieces, is going to continue to evolve, really does call attention to maybe taking a moment and thinking about this whole digital transformation and what it means to us as humans.
Humans, I'm the great news is that I know Justin and Eliza are great parents, and so things evolve. And as we heard in our some of our interviews in that previous podcast about the generations, people pass things down from generation to generation. And I really got to a point where it was really depressing watching what happened to the news media. And certainly you can look at CNN, Fox, MSNBC, any of the major news distributors on television right now, and look at the partisanship and the clickbait stuff and the focus on, all kinds of things that we could say there could be better focus on other things. But again, think about the fact that this is so new to us as a culture. And I sometimes wish that, I'll have the opportunity in 100 years to see how it all turns out. But I did go through a period where I was really, really disheartened. And I think the end of that, after a lot of deep thought and critical thinking and years of being removed from it, is that you have to have hope that humans will adapt to this in the best way possible.
I think your grandnieces or grandnephews will do a very good job of adapting to the new world, just like, like you said in our generational discussions, those episodes. Generation Z, I think, is going to surprise a lot of people, and so are the generations after them, because they are equipped, as our adaptive human DNA continues to display. They are equipped to handle this change. It's just going to be a matter of how we process it all and how we sift through this transitional time that we're in. Well, Vince, you had the front row view of the digital age transforming the delivery of news. And certainly you were right there in the weeds with it all as it was happening. But let me just ask this one last question. What do you think the lesson is to be learned from it all?
That's a great question. I think, there's lessons both for us as individuals and as a culture. Culturally, there's a couple of things that are at play here as well. This information explosion happened so fast that people couldn't get their arms around it. And by that, I mean politicians, regulatory committees, all kinds of things that are now becoming sort of in the forefront, where you have major tech companies now being scrutinized for things like, bias or preference or misinformation and that type of thing. I think we're just starting to get our arms around some of that. Politicians have certainly learned how to use, all of the platforms for propaganda. Consumers, however, I think are becoming more hip to propaganda when they hear it, because it's become so pervasive. And so I think we're at a real inflection point for the future.
I agree with you. And I agree with your point that today's youth are very savvy, very discerning, and because they're humans, are very able to adapt to this new wave of data and information bombardment. And I think it's nothing but good. I agree.
Well, thanks for having me as a guest, Joe. And I hope my chair wasn't too squeaky. And I have a question. Am I going to get a Friends in Wonder Yeti mug for being a guest on this show?
Vince,